The many-faced God had never made a mistake. That was the theology anyway. The cornerstone upon which the house of black and white had been built across centuries of careful, ritualized death. Every life taken was a gift offered to the God of many faces. Every contract fulfilled was sacred geometry, the universe balancing its ledger in blood. The faceless men did not err. They did not miscalculate. Yet they did not accidentally tear a hole in the fabric of what was known and drag something through from a place that had no name in any Westerosi tongue. And yet, the man materialized on the Bravosi docks at the third hour past midnight, emerging from a shimmer of wrongness in the salt air, the way a fever dream emerges from sleep. Suddenly, completely, with the quality of something that had always been there, and also had never existed before this precise moment. He was on his knees when the world solidified around him, one hand braced against the wet stone, the other pressed flat against a wound in his side that had been stitched and retorn and stitched again. So many times the skin there had forgotten what wholeness felt like. He wore black. He was always in black. His suit was expensive in the way that armor is expensive, not for aesthetics, but for purpose, for the way it moved with him, for what it concealed beneath the tailoring. His face was a geography of controlled damage, a jaw that had been broken and reset, eyes that had learned to count threats the way other men count coins, dark circles beneath them that suggested sleep was something that happened to other people. He looked up. Bravos looked back. The city rose from the lagoon in the pre-dawn murk, its towers catching the last of the moonlight, the Titan's silhouette enormous against a sky the color of a bruise fading. And the canal smelled of salt and fish, and the particular dampness of a city that had been built by escaped slaves who understood that water was the only moat that mattered. Lanterns burned amber along the waterways. A gondolier somewhere in the dark was singing something low and rhythmic that had no melody worth remembering. John Wick pressed his hand harder against his side, felt the familiar arithmetic of his own blood, and began to assess. He had been in an alley in New York 40 seconds ago, or 40 years ago, or never. The geometry of how he'd arrived was already dissolving like salt in the canal water. He remembered a gold coin on a stone floor, a man in a mask who moved wrong, and then the sound of something enormous inhaling. Now he was here, wherever here was, and the air tasted like nothing he had ever breathed, and the stars above him were arranged in configurations he didn't recognize. He had been in worse situations. He cataloged them briefly and decided this was still in the top 3. The faceless man found him 11 minutes later. They always found you. John had counted the rooftops, identified 4 probable exits from the dock district, located what appeared to be a blacksmith's forge 2 streets north, whose chimney still bled warmth, and was in the process of deciding whether his wound required immediate attention or merely urgent attention when he heard the footstep that was almost silent. Almost. He moved before turning. That was the discipline. That was the 20 years of making the body react before the mind had finished forming its question. He caught the wrist, redirected the blade, felt the faceless man's genuine surprise in the microsecond of resistance before training took over, and the man adjusted. They separated, stood, regarded each other across 4 feet of Bravosi dock with the particular stillness of 2 people who recognized what they were looking at. The faceless man wore a plain face, not his own. John understood this immediately in the way that people who operate in worlds of mass always understand mass. The face was borrowed. The posture beneath it was the real signature. Valor Morgulis, the man said. He said it the way you say something you've always said, the way you say your own name. John stared at him. The language was wrong, but the cadence was familiar. The cadence of someone offering a philosophy rather than a greeting. "Why, you brought me here," John said. A pause. The faceless man's borrowed face rearranged itself into something that was not quite an expression. The God reaches where the God reaches. We did not intend. "You brought me here." It wasn't a question the second time. Another pause. Longer. "Yes." John looked down at his wound. Looked back up. "Then you owe me." The faceless man had been serving death for longer than this city had stood above the lagoon. He had faced kings begging for mercy, generals weeping for their children, assassins who thought themselves untouchable. He had never in all that time felt what he felt now, which was the specific, bone-deep understanding that the man bleeding quietly on this dock was not afraid of him, not performing calm, not bargaining through terror. Genuinely, constitutionally, perhaps pathologically unafraid. He had brought through something the god had not anticipated. "Come," he said after a moment. "Wei, your wound requires attention." "I know," John said, and followed him into the city without looking back at whatever shimmer in the air had delivered him here. Looking back was for people who had somewhere to return to. The House of Black and White materialized from the Bravosi pre-dawn like a philosophical statement. Black on one side, white on the other. The doors so large they suggested not a building, but a threshold. The pool inside smelled of still water and something beneath the water that had no name in any language John spoke. Candles burned in their hundreds along the walls, throwing light over the faces of 100 gods carved in stone. Death wearing every mask humanity had ever given it across every culture that had ever feared the dark. John looked at the gods. He had known men like them. He had worked for organizations like this. He understood, in his marrow, made the particular religion of structured death. The girl watched him from the shadows as they treated his wound, young with the kind of stillness that is only achieved through systematic dismantling of everything soft. She was studying him the way he had studied the docks. He noted her and filed her away. Later, when the faceless man who had found him, who called himself no name worth giving, sat across a stone table and laid out what John Wick was now owed for the god's error, John listened. The offer was familiar in structure: service, shelter, identity, purpose, a place within a system. The faceless men did not make this offer to outsiders. They were making it now because the alternative, attempting to silence the man across the table, had already been silently calculated and silently abandoned. You didn't send one man to kill John Wick. Westeros was about to learn this. "I'm not interested in serving your god," John said when the offer was complete. "But I need information. Was maps, language, who holds power in this world and how they hold it. And in return," John looked at the stone faces of 100 gods of death watching from the walls. "3 names," he said. "When I'm ready, I give you 3 names. Your god gets 3 gifts. We're square." The faceless man was quiet for a long time. "Valar Morghulis," he said finally. "Sure," John said. "Whatever that means. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, right, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure." The education took 3 weeks. John Wick was not a patient man by nature. Patience had been installed in him the way you install load-bearing walls, through necessity and structural violence, because the alternative was collapse. He had learned to be still in the way that predators learn stillness, not as rest, Shri, but as a different kind of readiness. So he sat in the House of Black and White, while the no-name faceless man taught him the shape of the world he'd fallen into, and he listened the way he'd always listened, completely, retaining everything, discarding nothing, filing each piece of information in the architecture of his mind where it would wait until he needed it. The known world was not small. That was the first thing he understood. This was not a city, not a country, not a criminal empire with defined borders and a governing body he could map. This was a continent, 2 continents divided by a sea, with thousands of years of history grinding beneath its present like tectonic plates. And the political situation sitting atop all of it was so volatile that 3 weeks of instruction barely scraped the surface. There was a throne made of swords. Multiple men claimed it. They were killing each other over it with the particular enthusiasm of people who had convinced themselves that a chair justified everything. To the north, something older than the throne and more dangerous than any of the men fighting over it was moving through the cold. The faceless man mentioned this last, almost as a footnote, which told John everything he needed to know about how Westeros prioritized its problems. "The great houses," John said on the 4th day, studying the map spread across the stone table. He'd asked for it on the first day. They'd provided it on the 4th, which told him something about how the faceless men negotiated. Walk me through the ones currently trying to kill each other. All of them are currently trying to kill each other. The main ones. What emerged over the following days was a picture John recognized in its bones, if not its specifics. A power vacuum created by a king's death. Robert Baratheon, whose capacity for drinking and hunting had apparently exceeded his capacity for governance. His heir, a boy named Joffrey, who wore the crown the way cruelty wears a face, easily, naturally, without any sense that it might be taken away. Behind the boy, his mother, Cersei Lannister, who understood power the way John understood a room full of threats, completely, constantly, without ever looking like she was looking. The Lannisters held King's Landing and the Iron Throne. And they held it through gold, through armies, and through the particular genius of Tywin Lannister, whose reputation for cold strategic brutality John filed next to the names of men like Viggo Tarasov and the Elder. Men who had built systems instead of empires, who understood that fear was more durable than loyalty, and who were consequently more dangerous than any soldier. In the north, the Starks were broken. Their lord was dead, executed publicly, one which was either a catastrophic political miscalculation or a very deliberate message. And from what John understood of Tywin Lannister, it was the latter. Their eldest son was fighting a war he was winning militarily and losing politically because he had broken a marriage vow for love and was now discovering what Westeros did to men who let sentiment override strategy. John understood this particular lesson. He had learned it himself in a different world, with a dog and a car and a grief that had reshuffled everything. He did not say this. He filed it and moved on. There was a girl across the narrow sea, a Targaryen, last of a dynasty, with 3 dragons and an army, and the kind of absolute certainty that was either destiny or delusion, and wouldn't be clear which until it was too late to matter. The faceless man spoke of her with a careful neutrality that was itself a kind of opinion. And the faceless men, John asked, where do you sit in all of this? We sit nowhere. We serve the god. We fulfill contracts. Who funds the contracts? A pause. Anyone with the means to pay. The Iron Bank. Often. John looked at the map. Bravo sat on it like a spider at the center of a web. Not through military power, but through something more durable. Money. The Iron Bank of Braavos financed the wars that the great houses fought. It backed the winning sides, or created winning sides by withdrawing support from the losing ones. In a world where armies required gold and gold required banks, the institution that held the gold held something more fundamental than any throne. He understood this model. The High Table had operated on similar principles, not through direct force, but through the infrastructure that made force possible. Control the systems, and the people operating within the systems control themselves. And the difference was that the High Table had rules, inviolable ones that John had watched men die for breaking and had himself broken and had paid for in ways that were still compounding interest. The Iron Bank, from what he could gather, had no rules. It had only mathematics. On the 15th day, the girl found him sharpening a blade he'd acquired from a Braavosi water dancer who had made the mistake of assuming that unfamiliar fighting styles were superior to ones he hadn't encountered before. The blade was Braavosi, thin, quick, designed for a style of combat that valued precision over power. John had spent 3 days adapting his technique to it. He wasn't satisfied yet. "You move wrong," the girl said from the doorway. He looked up. She had the stillness he'd noted on the first night, more developed now that he was seeing it in daylight, more deliberate. She had been trained, not finished, but seriously started. "I move effectively," he said. "You move like someone who expects his enemies to stand still." He considered this. "What's your name?" "I have no name." "What were you called before you had no name?" A long pause. The kind of pause that contained a history. "It doesn't matter." John returned to the blade. "You're training to be one of them." "I am one of them." "No," he said without particular cruelty. "You're training. There's a difference. You still flinch when you make a choice." He glanced up. "I'm not criticizing. Flinching means something in you is still alive. Hold on to it longer than they'll tell you to. The girl studied him with the focused attention of someone cataloging a threat they haven't fully classified. Hey, yeah, they say the god brought you here by mistake. The god and I have that in common, John said. I've made a few myself. She left without another word. He filed her away in the category of variables that were not yet threats and might become something else entirely. Assets, complications, or simply people, which in his experience was often the most dangerous category of all. On the 22nd day, the Iron Bank sent a representative to the House of Black and White. This was not, to the no-named faceless man told him, something that happened. And yet, John said. And yet, the faceless man agreed. The representative's name was Tycho Nestoris. He arrived in the manner of all truly powerful men, without urgency, without display, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that his presence was itself a statement. He was lean, precise, dressed in the colors of Bravosi finance, and he looked at John Wick across the House of Black and White's stone table with the expression of a man examining an acquisition he had already decided to make. We know what you are, Tycho said, or rather, we know what you do. The water dancer whose blade you carry told the story before he told anything else. We have been watching the House of Black and White's unusual guest. Then you know I'm not for sale, John said. Everyone is for sale, Tycho said pleasantly. The negotiation is simply about the currency. He set a single object on the stone table between them, a gold coin, Bravosi minted, stamped with the Iron Bank's seal. We don't want to buy you, Mr. Wick. We want to retain you. There's a difference. John looked at the coin. He had carried one like it, from a different world, a different system, and it had torn him through to this one. What's the job? He said. The job. As Tycho Nestoris explained it, with the unhurried precision of a man reading from a ledger that had already been balanced, was not a single contract. It was a position. The Iron Bank did not hire assassins. That was the faceless men's theology, and the bank was careful never to blur the line between finance and murder. Not because the distinction was morally meaningful to them, but because the distinction was legally useful. What the Iron Bank hired, on rare occasions, was a problem resolver. Someone who operated in the spaces between the bank's official instruments of pressure, the called debts, the withdrawn financing, the quiet letters that arrived in throne rooms and made kings sweat, and the outcomes those instruments failed to produce. The Iron Bank was owed an extraordinary amount of money by the Iron Throne. The Iron Throne was currently occupied by a boy who did not understand mathematics and a mother who understood it perfectly and had decided that understanding it was someone else's problem. The debt was not the issue. The bank had waited centuries for repayment before and would wait centuries again. The issue was precedent. If the Iron Throne defaulted without consequence, other debtors would notice. The entire architecture of Westerosi finance, which was to say the entire architecture of Westerosi power, would develop a structural crack that would eventually become a collapse. The bank needed a message delivered, not in writing. Stannis Baratheon has approached us for financing, Tycho said, turning the gold coins slowly on the stone table with one finger. He has the strongest legal claim to the Iron Throne. He has an army, a castle, and a religious advisor who is either genuinely touched by a god or the most effective manipulator in the known world. The distinction matters less than you might think. What he lacks is momentum, the perception of inevitability. Tycho paused. You understand perception. I understand it, John said. We intend to back Stannis. But before we commit our full support, before we send a representative to Dragonstone and formalize the arrangement, we need the current regime in King's Landing to understand that their debt has consequences. Tycho finally lifted his finger from the coin. Not a direct action, nothing that can be traced to the bank. Simply an education, delivered to a specific member of Cersei Lannister's network of financial intermediaries. A man named Hallard, who has been actively working to convince other Bravosi lending houses to extend the throne's credit on the bank's behalf, undermining our leverage. He looked at John with the mild expression of someone discussing shipping routes. He should stop doing that. You want him dead. I want him to understand the cost of continuing. A pause. Dead is one form of understanding. We leave the pedagogy to you. John was quiet for a moment. The house of black and white sat around them in its particular silence. The candles, the pool, the 100 stone gods watching everyone's negotiations with equal indifference. I need equipment, John said. Weapons, Westerosi weapons, local steel, things that don't draw attention, clothes that fit this city, a safe location in King's Landing that isn't connected to you or the faceless men. 3 days of intelligence on Hallard's movements, security, in personal relationships, specifically anyone he'd trust enough to open a door for. He paused. And horses. Good ones. Tycho smiled with one side of his mouth. You'll find Bravosi gold opens most doors in most cities. Gold opens doors, John said. I need what's behind them. The arrangements took 4 days. John spent them learning the city he was about to leave, the canal rhythms, the water dancer culture that doubled as a fighting tradition, what are the specific texture of a place built on freedom's mythology and commerce's reality. Bravos was a city that had never been conquered, and it moved with the particular confidence of that fact. He respected it the way he respected any system that had survived long enough to become its own argument for survival. He also spent time with the Bravosi blade and with 2 shorter weapons the bank's contact had acquired. Local steel, heavier than he preferred but workable, balanced for the kind of close-quarters violence that castle corridors produced. He adapted. He always adapted. Adaptation was the only skill that mattered more than any other skill, because it was the one that kept all the others useful. The ship crossed the narrow sea in 6 days of gray water and variable wind. John stood at the prow for most of it, watching the waves and cataloging what he knew about where he was going. King's Landing, in the largest city in Westeros. 500,000 people crammed onto a hill above a bay, organized around a castle that housed the Iron Throne and everyone who wanted to control who sat on it. A city of competing intelligence networks, Varys's little birds moving through the low places, Littlefinger's informants moving through the financial ones, Cersei's agents moving through the noble houses, in and beneath all of them the ordinary machinery of crime and poverty and survival that existed in every city, regardless of who claimed to govern it. He had worked in cities like this. The infrastructure differed. No continental, no gold coin system, no organization that enforced rules across criminal hierarchies. What Westeros had instead was something older and less stable: personal loyalty, family obligation, and the threat of violence with no governing body to keep that threat within functional limits. It was, in John's professional assessment, an environment that would make his work significantly easier in some respects and significantly more unpredictable in others. King's Landing announced itself by smell before it announced itself by sight. The particular combination of too many people, inadequate sanitation, sea air, and the specific rotting grandeur of a city that had been powerful long enough to stop maintaining itself. The bay was crowded with ships. The docks were crowded with people. The city above the docks was crowded with everything else, climbing the hill in layers of wealth and desperation toward the Red Keep's towers, catching the late afternoon light like something that didn't belong to the city below it, but merely watched it. John moved through the docks like a man who had always been there. This was a learnable skill, not invisibility, which was a fantasy, but irrelevance. Making yourself the thing a crowd's eye slides past. He wore rougher clothes than he preferred. He carried the short blades under them in configurations that Bravosi tailoring had been adjusted to accommodate. The safe house was a room above a tanner's workshop in the Street of Steel district, chosen by the bank's King's Landing contact for its proximity to the goldsmith quarter, where Hallard conducted his business, its 2 exits, and its window line that covered the street below without being visible from it. John arrived at dusk, inspected every corner, tested both exits, noted which floorboards announced weight and which absorbed it, and then sat in the single chair and began the work of becoming someone this city didn't know existed. He had 3 days of intelligence on Hallard waiting for him. Parchment, not paper, written in a cramped hand that he read 3 times before setting aside. Hallard was a cautious man who used caution the way cautious men always used it, inconsistently. He varied his routes but not his timing. He employed 2 guards whose competence John assessed from the written descriptions as adequate against Westerosi threats. He had a wife he visited on the 7th day of each week and a creditor he avoided on the 3rd. He trusted his house steward completely, which was the gap. John ate the rations he'd brought from the ship, drank the water he'd tested from the room's basin, and slept 4 hours with his back against the wall and the shorter blade within reach. In the morning, he went to introduce himself to King's Landing. What he found instead, in the narrow street outside the tanner's workshop at the 6th hour, was a small man in expensive clothes who was pretending not to watch him with the practiced inattention of someone who had spent years learning how to watch people without appearing to. The man had a goblet of wine despite the morning hour, a wit behind his eyes that was doing rapid calculations, and the specific quality of stillness that belonged to people who survived dangerous environments through intelligence rather than strength. The small man looked at John. John looked at the small man. You arrived on a Bravo Sea merchant vessel 4 days after a representative of the Iron Bank crossed the narrow sea, Tyrion Lannister said pleasantly, which is either coincidence or cause and effect. Yeah, and I have found that coincidence is usually the word people use when they can't prove cause and effect. He swirled his wine. Whoever you are, you're in my city. I thought it was only courteous to say hello. John looked at Tyrion Lannister for a long moment, the kind of look that was itself a form of information gathering, slow and complete, the way you read a room before you entered it. What he saw was a man who had survived in an environment designed to kill him, not through luck or protection, but through the particular armor of being underestimated and the particular weapon of being smarter than everyone who underestimated him. John recognized the type. He had worked alongside versions of it. He had on occasion been contracted to remove versions of it, and those had always been the contracts that required the most preparation. Tyrion Lannister, John said. Not a question. Edward Tyrion raised his goblet in acknowledgement. You have the advantage of me, though I suspect that's a condition you cultivate professionally. John Wick. A name that tells me nothing about where you're from, who sent you, or what you intend to do in my city. Tyrion's eyes were doing the same thing John's had done, cataloging, assessing, filing. And though the way you're standing tells me several things I find professionally concerning, such as, you've already identified 4 ways to end this conversation that don't involve talking. Tyrion smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that acknowledged the game rather than pretending it wasn't being played. Don't. I'm genuinely curious about you, which is rarer than you might think. Most people in King's Landing bore me within the first sentence. John considered the street around them. 2 of Tyrion's guards were positioned at the alley entrance to his left. Good spacing, competent placement, better than Hallard's men. A 3rd was on the roof opposite, which showed either Tyrion's genuine caution or someone on his staff who understood sightlines. John had noted all 3 before Tyrion finished his first sentence. You're the hand of the king, John said. Acting. My father holds the title officially and wields it from wherever my father chooses to wield things. Which is wherever the killing needs doing. Tyrion descended from the step he'd been standing on, which brought him to a height that he navigated with the ease of long practice. Walk with me. I'll show you a city that will either fascinate or horrify you, and we can discuss why the Iron Bank has taken a sudden interest in King's Landing's hospitality sector. John walked with him because the alternative was a confrontation that would accomplish nothing yet and create complications he didn't need. Information was the priority. Tyrion Lannister, who appeared to know things about John's arrival that he shouldn't have known, was a source of information. John had worked with more dangerous sources for less useful intelligence. My King's Landing in the morning was a city removing its night face and replacing it with its day face, which was not significantly more honest. The Street of Steel gave way to the broader thoroughfares of the merchant quarter, which gave way to the approaches of Flea Bottom, where the city's poverty concentrated itself in the particular density that poverty always achieved when surrounded by wealth it couldn't access. John noted the geography with the automatic attention of someone who operated in cities professionally. The choke points, the crowd patterns, the places where visibility dropped and noise rose, and a man could move without being tracked. You're mapping us, Tyrion observed. Habit, a professional habit. Tyrion navigated a crowded market stall with practiced ease, his guards adjusting their formation without being directed. Let me tell you what I know, which will save us both the performance of you pretending you're a wool merchant and me pretending I believe you. He paused to examine a length of fabric with the genuine interest of a man who appreciated quality, then set it down. A man arrived in Bravos 3 weeks ago from nowhere that any port authority could document. He stayed in the house of Black and White, not as a supplicant, which would be unusual, but apparently as a guest, which is unprecedented. Within a week, Antico Nestoris requested a private meeting with this individual. 4 days later, the individual books passage to King's Landing on a bank-connected vessel. Tyrion looked up. Varys's little birds sing even across the narrow sea. I find their music educational. What do you want? Jon said. Tyrion seemed to appreciate the directness. He stopped walking and turned to face Jon, with the full attention of a man who had decided the performance portion of the conversation was complete. I want to know if you're here to destabilize the current regime, which I should note I have complicated feelings about, being both a member of it and frequently appalled by it, or if you're here to do something more targeted that I could potentially find useful. And if I'm here to do something you'd find inconvenient, then we'd have a different conversation. Tyrion's expression shifted, not threatening, but honest, which was more unsettling. Why I should tell you that I've already dispatched a raven to my father describing your general profile and suspected bank connection. Tywin Lannister will want to meet you. That isn't a threat. It's a weather report. My father is a force of nature. Knowing he's coming is simply useful information. Jon absorbed this. The Hallard operation had a timeline, and Tywin Lannister's awareness complicated it. Not fatally, but meaningfully. He recalculated. Your city has a debt problem, Jon said. Yes, Tyrion's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement, or might have been the specific pain of someone who managed finances and found them consistently humiliating. My city has several debt problems. You'll need to be specific. The Iron Throne owes the Iron Bank a sum that your current financial position makes it impossible to repay under the current regime. The bank is losing patience. They're making alternative arrangements. Jon watched Tyrion's face. You already know this. I know the debt exists. I know it's substantial. I know that my sister views financial obligations with the same respect she views most obligations, which is to say, she views them as things that apply to other people. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. Who is the bank's target? Jon said nothing. Hallard, Tyrion said. Not a guess. A confirmation of something he'd already suspected. He exhaled slowly. He's been useful to us, and monumentally stupid, which is a combination I find consistently tragic in otherwise capable men. He turned and began walking again, and Jon walked beside him because the conversation wasn't finished. I'm not going to interfere with whatever you've been retained to do to him. Hallard made his choices, but I am going to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer. Ask. Are you the most dangerous man currently inside these walls? Jon considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Sure, probably. Tyrion nodded slowly, as though this confirmed rather than alarmed. Then I have a proposition that has nothing to do with the bank and everything to do with the fact that King's Landing is about to become significantly more dangerous than it currently is, which is already saying something. He stopped at a corner where the merchant quarter met the approaches to the Street of Sisters, and the Red Keep's towers were visible above the rooftops, red stone catching the midday light. Wait, my mother is dead. My nephew is a sadist with a crown. My sister would burn this city to ash rather than relinquish it. My father is brilliant, ruthless, and entirely convinced that Lannister's supremacy is equivalent to Westerosi stability, which it is not. He looked at Jon with an expression that contained more honesty than most men showed in a lifetime. I need someone in this city who is not playing the game, who can operate outside it, who is, for lack of a better phrase, genuinely frightening to people who are not frightened by conventional threats. You want insurance, Jon said. I want someone in this city whose presence makes the people who would do catastrophic things pause long enough to reconsider. Tyrion spread his hands. Not a protector, not a weapon, a variable. Someone that Cersei's calculations can't account for, that Littlefinger's schemes can't map, that even my father's strategic genius has to acknowledge as genuinely unpredictable. John looked at the Red Keep's towers. He thought about the debt that had been explained to him in the House of Black and White, and the Hallard contract, and the three names he'd promised to the faceless men's god, and the cold that the faceless man had mentioned almost as a footnote, and that John had not stopped thinking about since. "I'll finish what I came to do," John said. "After that, I will talk." Tyrion raised his goblet. "In King's Landing, that's the closest thing to a promise anyone ever keeps." He paused. "One more thing. My sister knows you're here. She's been informed of your profile and your probable purpose. Whatever you're doing, do it before she decides on her response." "How long do I have?" Tyrion considered. "She's already decided. You have until she acts on it, which depends on how many people she needs to move into position." He looked genuinely apologetic. "I'd suggest expedience." John had already turned back toward the Street of Steel. Hallard died on the second night. John had not intended to kill him. The bank's instruction had been education, not termination, and John Wick was, whatever else could be said about him, a professional who delivered what was contracted rather than what was convenient. He had spent the first day establishing the shape of Hallard's security in 3 dimensions. The 2 guards whose competence he'd already assessed from parchment and confirmed through observation, the house steward whose trust Hallard extended completely, and whose loyalty John had determined within 4 hours of watching cost approximately 12 silver stags and a promise of protection that Hallard was in no position to keep. He had spent the evening removing the steward from the equation through a conversation in a tavern near the Goldsmith Quarter that involved neither violence nor significant expenditure. Simply the correct information delivered to the correct person about what happened to men who served sinking ships in a city that kept very precise records of who had served what. The steward sent word the following morning that Hallard's eastern side entrance would be unlatched at the second hour past midnight. John went in through the western wall instead, because doors that were open for you were doors that were watched. The guards he put down quietly, not permanently, which required more precision than killing, but was the kind of precision John applied automatically, the way a craftsman applies the correct tool to the correct task without deliberating over it. The first in the corridor outside Hallard's counting room, with a hold that compressed the right vessels for the right duration. When the second at the top of the stairs with a variation of the same, adjusted for the angle and the man's significant size advantage, which stopped mattering approximately 4 seconds into the engagement. John moved through the house the way water moved through a system of pipes, finding the path of least resistance, following the architecture's logic, arriving where he intended to arrive without announcing the journey. Hallard was awake. This was the variable John hadn't fully weighted. The man was at his counting table at the second hour past midnight, surrounded by ledgers and candle smoke, and the specific anxiety of someone who had received enough threatening correspondence recently to make sleep a professional luxury. He was a heavy-set man in his middle years, with the careful hands of someone who worked with numbers and the careful eyes of someone who had made those numbers say things they didn't naturally say. Yet he looked up when John came through the door and did not scream, which John noted as either courage or the paralysis that sometimes wore Courage's face. "The Iron Bank sends its regards," John said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across the counting table, which was a deliberate choice. The posture of a conversation rather than an execution. "You've been doing work on their behalf that they didn't commission. They'd like you to stop." Hallard's eyes moved to the door John had come through. Calculated, returned. "My guards are fine," John said. "This doesn't have to go further than this room. Stop the work. Send word to the houses you've been coordinating that the arrangement is concluded. Do it in writing, with enough specificity that the bank's people can verify it. You have 4 days." Hallard was quiet for a moment. The candles threw shadows across the ledgers between them, air across the columns of figures that represented the architecture of his betrayal, rendered in ink. He was thinking. John could see him thinking, could see the calculation running behind his eyes, the assessment of options, the particular moment when a man decided that the threat in front of him was less dangerous than the threat behind him. Lord Tywin has guaranteed my protection, Hallard said. John looked at him. It was not a threatening look. It was simply a look. Steady, complete. Oh, entirely without the performance of menace, because performance was for people who needed their threats to do work that their presence couldn't. The look said, with perfect clarity and zero embellishment, that the name Hallard had just said was a piece of information John had already processed and found insufficient. Hallard reached for something beneath the counting table. John was already moving when the blade came up. Not fast, not a trained draw. The desperate motion of a man who had decided that 4 days was a promise he couldn't survive keeping, and that the figure across his table needed to be dead before that calculation was completed. The blade was short, Westerosi made, and it covered the distance between them in a motion that would have been adequate against most threats. John redirected it with his left hand, feeling the edge open a shallow cut across his palm that he noted and dismissed. I'd used Hallard's own forward momentum to bring him across the table, and in the space of the next 4 seconds made a series of decisions that closed every option except one. Hallard did not survive the 4th second. John stood in the counting room with the candles burning and the ledgers undisturbed, and the body of a man who had made 3 consecutive poor decisions. And he was still for a moment in the way he was always still after. Not with regret, which was a luxury, but with the particular clarity that followed completed work. He looked at the ledgers, looked at the body, looked at the door. Tywin Lannister had guaranteed protection, which meant Tywin Lannister had known Hallard was exposed, had known the Iron Bank's displeasure, and had positioned Hallard as a resource in a negotiation with the bank rather than as a person with interests worth protecting. Now, Hallard had believed the guarantee because men who needed protection always believed the guarantees of people who offered it, because the alternative was confronting the fact that they were pieces on a board rather than players at a table. John understood this dynamic intimately. He had been a piece on someone else's board. He had spent considerable time in violence becoming something boards couldn't contain. He left Hallard's house through the western wall, which was unobserved, and was back in the room above the tanner's workshop before the 3rd hour. He cleaned the cut on his palm with water and linen, assessed its depth, determined it required no further attention, and sat in the chair and thought about Tywin Lannister. Varys found him at dawn, not in the way that Tyrion had found him, not through the performance of a chance encounter in a street that both parties understood was not chance. Varys arrived at the room above the tanner's workshop by coming through the window, which required either knowledge of the location that no one should have had or an intelligence network so comprehensive that the concept of private space became theoretical. He was a large, soft-looking man in robes the color of deep water, and with a shaved head and hands folded before him in the manner of someone who had arranged their physical presentation to suggest harmlessness so consistently that the suggestion had become its own form of power. He looked at the room. He looked at John. He looked at the cleaned linen and the blade on the table beside the chair. Hallard, Varys said. Wait, was it a question? An observation. Varys settled himself on the room's single stool with the ease of someone who had held court in worse accommodations. I know 17 things about you, Mr. Wick, none of which I fully understand, all of which I find extraordinary. You arrived from nowhere that exists on any map I possess. You negotiated with the faceless men from a position of leverage, which no one does. When you hold a gold coin from a mint I cannot identify after consulting the Iron Bank's entire catalog of known currency. He tilted his head. You are not from this world. The silence in the room changed quality slightly. What I know of your world, Varys continued, comes from the fevered writings of a Meister who visited Braavos 40 years ago and reported a conversation with a faceless man about the gods' reach. That death does not respect the boundaries between what is and what might be. He looked at John with eyes that missed nothing and revealed nothing in return. You were brought here by a mistake. You intend to resolve your immediate obligations and then, what? There is no door home that I can find. John had not spent significant time on this problem because significant time on unsolvable problems was a resource expenditure that produced nothing useful. He acknowledged it now with the same flatness he acknowledged all the things he couldn't change. Then I work with what's here, he said. Varys smiled, a real one, small and genuine. the smile of someone who recognized a philosophy they respected. I serve the realm, Mr. Wick, not the king, not the family, the realm, the people in it who have no power and no voice, and no one making decisions with their survival in mind. He unfolded his hands. You are the most dangerous individual currently inside these walls. I have no mechanism to remove you, no leverage to redirect you, and no certainty about your intentions. He paused. So I've come to understand them directly. Tyrion asked me to be a variable, Jon said, and something Cersei's calculations can't account for. Tyrion is clever and means well, and is wrong about what this city needs. Varys leaned forward slightly. What this city needs, Mr. Wick, is for someone to understand that the game being played here is not the real game. The real game is north, and it is coming whether or not anyone in King's Landing chooses to acknowledge it. He held Jon's gaze. I think you already know this. I think the faceless man told you about the cold as a footnote, and it has been in the back of your mind ever since. Jon said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. I don't need your service, Varys said, rising from the stool. I need your awareness. Whatever you do in this city, and I suspect you will do considerable things, remember that none of it matters against what is coming from the north. He moved toward the window. And Cersei has dispatched 4 men to this location. They'll arrive within the hour. I'd suggest being elsewhere. He left through the window as smoothly as he'd entered. Jon was already packing. Cersei's 4 men became 6 before they reached the Street of Steel. Jon knew this because he had been on the roof of the cooperage across the lane when they arrived at the tanner's workshop, and he had watched them come from 2 directions. 4 from the north end of the street, to 2 more appearing from the alley that accessed the workshop's rear exit, which meant either Varys's intelligence had been slightly wrong about the number, or Cersei had added to the detail between the spider's departure and the team's arrival. Neither possibility concerned him particularly. What concerned him, in the mild professional way that threats concerned him, rather than the emotional way that fear concerned lesser operators, was the quality of the men. They were Lannister household guard, not the gold-cloaked City Watch, whose competence Jon had assessed from 3 days of observation as adequate for managing drunks and inadequate for managing anything else, but private soldiers in unmarked clothing who moved with the coordinated precision of men who had trained together and killed together and understood the geometry of a building clearance. Their leader was a scarred man in his 40s who positioned his people correctly before sending the first 2 through the door, which was the decision of someone who had done this before and survived it, which meant he was more careful than most of the men Jon had killed and would require a different approach than simply faster violence. Jon watched them clear the empty room from the rooftop and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it, the specific sensation of a contingency proving necessary. He had packed the essentials before Varys finished his exit through the window. He had identified the cooperage roof as an observation position on his first day in this district. He had left nothing in the room above the tanner's workshop except the chair, the basin, upward in a small square of parchment on the counting table that contained 2 words in the cramped hand he'd spent 3 days developing. Too slow. He did not leave it to be cruel. He left it because Cersei Lannister was a threat that needed managing, and the management of threats in environments without the Continental's governing structure required a different toolkit than direct confrontation. The Continental's rules had created predictability. You knew how an enemy would behave because the rules constrained everyone equally. In King's Landing, there were no rules, which meant the only constraint was psychology, and psychology could be shaped. He wanted Cersei uncertain. Uncertainty slowed decisions. Slowed decisions created space. He moved across 3 rooftops before descending into an alley that connected to the Street of Sisters through a passage that the city's architecture had created accidentally when 2 buildings were constructed without coordinating their rear walls. He had found it on his second day. He used it now and emerged into foot traffic that absorbed him the way crowds always absorb people who moved with the correct body language. Not furtive, which drew attention, but purposeful, which rendered you invisible by making you look like you belonged to wherever you were going. He needed a new location and a conversation he'd been deferring. Tyrion was in a tavern near the Street of Silk, not hiding, which would have been beneath him. But occupying a corner table with a cup of wine and a book in the studied air of a man who read in public, because reading in public was its own kind of armor. His guards were positioned less visibly than they'd been in the street, which meant either Tyrion had refined his security arrangements after their first meeting, or he'd been expecting Jon specifically and adjusted for an audience of one. Jon sat across from him without invitation. "Hallard," Tyrion said, turning a page. "Your father guaranteed his protection. My father guarantees things with the same generosity he demonstrates in all things, strategically, temporarily, and with complete awareness that the guarantee is a tool rather than a commitment." Tyrion closed the book. "Hallard was useful leverage against the Iron Bank. Now he's leverage of a different kind. A demonstration that the bank operates beyond the reach of Lannister protection, which is information my father will find useful in recalibrating his approach to the debt question." He looked at Jon with the expression of someone delivering an unpleasant truth to someone capable of handling it. "What you did my father's work for him, he'll appreciate the efficiency." "I know," Jon said. Tyrion paused. "You know." Hallard reached for a blade. The contract became irrelevant. Jon looked at the wine cup between them. "Your father wanted him dead. The bank wanted him educated. Hallard made the decision that resolved the conflict. And now my father wants to meet the man who resolved it." Tyrion set the book aside entirely. "He's arrived in the city. He sent for you this morning. Or rather, he sent for the profile Varys provided him, which is you assembled from second-hand observation and inference." He paused. "I should tell you that my father is the most dangerous man in Westeros." "People keep saying that about different people," Jon said. "In most cases, they're wrong. In this case, they're right, with the qualification that dangerous means something specific when applied to Tywin Lannister. It means he will use you completely, discard you efficiently, and arrange circumstances so that the discarding appears to be your own decision." Tyrion's voice carried the particular weight of personal experience. "I say this not to warn you away from meeting him, because you'll meet him regardless of what I say, but so that you walk in with accurate information." "When?" "This evening. The Red Keep. I'll arrange entry." Tyrion picked up his wine. "One more thing. Cersei knows the room was empty. She's not retreating, she's reclassifying. You've moved from unknown asset to active problem in her threat assessment, which means she'll be more systematic about it." He drank. "My sister's systematic is considerably more dangerous than her impulsive." Jon spent the hours before the evening moving through King's Landing with the twin purposes of learning its geography more completely and making himself visible in enough locations to complicate any surveillance pattern Cersei's people were trying to establish. He moved through Flea Bottom's warrens, where the city's poverty concentrated into a texture of survival that he recognized from other places. The specific resourcefulness of people who had nothing and had organized their lives around making nothing sufficient. He moved through the market near the Gate of the Gods, through the approaches to the Sept of Baelor, where the Faith's presence made the street feel watched in a different way than Varys's network made it feel watched. He bought food from a stall near the Dragon Pit, dried meat and hard bread, adequate, and ate it while watching the pit's sealed gates and thinking about what had been kept in there once and what keeping it had meant. Power that required a container was not gone. It was waiting. The Red Keep at evening was a different building than it was in daylight. The red stone deepening towards something that looked organic in the torchlight, the shadows between the towers growing complex and deliberate. The sound of the city below replaced by the sound of a place that understood itself as separate from the city below. Jon entered through a servant's passage that Tyrion's man indicated with a brevity that suggested the route was used often, and by people who found front doors ideologically inconvenient. Tywin Lannister was in a small council chamber, alone, standing at the window that overlooked the bay. He did not turn when Jon entered, which was either a power gesture or a genuine indifference to physical threat, and Jon assessed it as both simultaneously. A man who was making the gesture because he genuinely didn't feel the threat, which was more dangerous than performing confidence. He was tall, precisely dressed, with the kind of face that had been hard for so long it had forgotten the architecture of softness. His hands were clasped behind his back, and he looked out at the bay with the expression of a man examining something he owned. "Sit," he said. John sat because this was not a battle, and sitting cost nothing. Tywin turned. He looked at John with eyes that did what John's eyes did, counted, assessed, filed, and did it with the additional quality of a man who had been doing it for 50 years and had developed an efficiency that approached something like contempt for the process. And because the process always arrived at the same conclusion. Everyone was manageable. "The Iron Bank retained you," Tywin said. "Not a question. For a specific task," John said. "Completed. And now? Unaffiliated." Tywin moved to the table and sat across from John with the unhurried movement of someone who had never needed to rush because the world arranged itself around his timing rather than the other way around. "You killed Hallard. Art, you incapacitated 6 of my household guard without killing any of them, which required more precision than killing them and suggests either a preference for minimum necessary force or a deliberate message." He looked at John. "Which was it?" "Both." Something moved in Tywin's eyes that might have been appreciation. "I want to retain your services, not for a specific task, for a period. One King's Landing is entering a phase that requires capabilities my current forces don't possess." He placed a hand flat on the table. "You'll be compensated appropriately. You'll have resources, access, and autonomy within defined parameters." "What are the parameters?" "Nothing that touches my family without my explicit sanction. Nothing that compromises the stability of the Iron Throne. Everything else, I don't need to know how you do it. I need results." He paused. "You're not from this world. I know this because no man with your capabilities appears from nowhere in a world where capabilities like yours leave records." He said it without drama, as a piece of information he had processed and filed. "That means you have no house, no family, no name that matters here, and no leverage I can apply to ensure your compliance." He looked directly at John. "So I'll ask directly. What do you want?" John thought about Varys's window exit and the word north spoken like a footnote that was actually the entire document. He thought about the cold that the faceless man had mentioned and the thing beyond the wall that everyone in this city was too busy playing their game to look at. "Information," John said. "Everything you know about what's happening north of the wall." Tywin's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of change. "Oh, that's an unusual currency." "It's what I want." A long silence. The bay outside the window reflected the last of the evening light in patterns that looked almost like writing if you were tired enough and had been thinking about Door's home long enough. "Then we have the beginning of an arrangement," Tywin said, "provided you understand something clearly." He leaned forward slightly, the first physical emphasis he'd used, which meant it carried weight. "Everyone in this city is a piece on a board, Mr. Wick, including the people who believe they're players." John held his gaze. "I've heard that before," he said. "The man who said it ended up on the board." Tywin Lannister was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Get out of my sight. We'll speak again tomorrow." John stood and left, and behind him the most powerful man in Westeros remained at the table for a long time, looking at the space where John had been with an expression that no one in King's Landing had ever put on Tywin Lannister's face before. Uncertainty. Littlefinger found him on the 3rd day after the Tywin meeting, which meant Littlefinger had been watching him for at least 5 days before that, and had chosen the 3rd day deliberately, which meant the timing was itself a message about how much Littlefinger knew and how long he'd been sitting on it. John had developed enough of a working model of Peter Baelish by this point, assembled from Tyrion's sardonic commentary, Varys's careful nondescriptions, and his own observation of the man moving through court with the specific quality of someone who was always arriving from somewhere and always about to leave for somewhere else. To understand that everything Littlefinger did was layered. The surface action concealed a secondary action which concealed the actual action. And the actual action was always the same action. Accumulation of leverage over people who didn't realize they were being leveraged until the leverage was applied. He came to John in the market near the Iron Gate in the late morning, materializing from the crowd with the ease of a man who had spent decades learning how crowds worked and had eventually concluded that crowds were just collections of people looking at something else. He was slight, in well-dressed in the understated way of someone who understood that true wealth didn't announce itself, with a neat beard and eyes that smiled independently of his mouth and were consequently never entirely trustworthy. "You've been busy," Littlefinger said, falling into step beside John with the familiarity of an old friend, which he established through body language rather than history, and which John did not return. "Lord Baelish," John said. "Peter, please." "Lord Baelish is my father, and my father is dead, which is one of the few advantages of coming from nothing. The title lands on you without the expectations attached." He glanced sideways at John with the eyes that were always computing. "You've met Tyrion. You've met my Lord Varys. You've had a private audience with Tywin Lannister, which approximately 4 people in the known world can claim, and 3 of them are related to him." He paused. "You've been collecting powerful men like a maester collects chains. I find myself wondering what you intend to build with them." "What do you want?" John said. "Directness. I appreciate it. Most people in this city perform indirection so consistently they've forgotten they're performing." Littlefinger navigated a cart being pulled across their path without breaking stride. "I want what I always want, which is for the world to be arranged slightly more to my advantage than it currently is. At this particular moment, that means I want a specific problem resolved, and you are the most elegant solution to that problem I've encountered." He glanced at John again. "Are you familiar with a lord named Edmure Tully?" John was. Tyrion had covered the major houses in their conversations. Tully of Riverrun, Lords of the Riverlands, uncle to Robb Stark's mother. He'd currently somewhere in the complicated geography of the War of 5 Kings, being a political and military liability to his nephew's cause in ways that were apparently consistent with his general pattern of behavior. "He's currently transporting something I need," Littlefinger said pleasantly. "Not a person, a document that would be, let's say, uncomfortable for certain parties if it arrived at its intended destination. The document is traveling with a Tully escort from Riverrun toward King's Landing, where it will be presented to the small council as evidence in a matter that would complicate several arrangements I've spent considerable time constructing." He smiled with his mouth. "I need the document intercepted, the escort managed. The document itself, I'll need it intact." "Who are the certain parties?" John said. "Does it matter?" "It determines whether I care about the complication." Littlefinger seemed genuinely amused by this. "The document is evidence of a financial arrangement between a Lannister bannerman and the Iron Bank that bypasses the Crown's official knowledge. If it reaches the small council, Tywin Lannister loses a useful intermediary and gains an embarrassing question about what his bannermen are doing with bank money without his sanction." He spread his hands. "Lord Tywin's dignity is not my primary concern. My concern is that the document also contains a secondary record, a list of names attached to a separate arrangement that is considerably more personally sensitive." He paused. "My name is on that list." John walked in silence for a moment. The market moved around them, merchants arguing, children running. You had a pair of gold cloaks conducting an inspection of a spice vendor with the particular enthusiasm of men who expected to be compensated for their thoroughness. "You want me to do this on Tywin's behalf," John said. "You've framed it as your problem, but you're going to let him know I acted in his interest, which makes him feel I'm operating within his arrangement while I'm actually operating within yours. And it gives you a demonstration of my capabilities that you can use to calibrate future requests." Littlefinger stopped walking. He looked at John with an expression that was the most honest thing John had seen on his face. Genuine surprise, recalibrated immediately into something that was both appreciation and wariness in equal measure. The surprise lasted perhaps 1 second. The recalibration was faster than most people's initial reactions. "Count, you're more dangerous than Varys told me," Littlefinger said. "Varys told you I was dangerous?" "Varys told me you were an unknown quantity, which is his way of saying dangerous while maintaining the performance of neutrality." He resumed walking. "Will you do it?" "Tell me the rest of it," John said. "Not the surface, the actual thing." A silence. The market noise filled it. Somewhere a vendor was arguing about the weight of a bolt of cloth with a fervor that suggested the weight of the cloth was standing in for something larger. "Robb Stark is going to lose the war," Littlefinger said, and the pleasantness in his voice was gone. not replaced by cruelty, but by something more unsettling, which was simple factual assessment delivered without emotional coloring. He's already lost it. He broke his marriage vow to House Frey. Walder Frey will not forgive this. I've had certain conversations with Lord Frey and with certain Lannister representatives about what forgiveness might be redirected toward instead. He looked at Jon sideways. The document contains the financial record of those conversations. If it reaches the small council before the arrangement is finalized, the arrangement becomes impossible to complete. Robb Stark survives the political consequence. The war continues. He paused. Would tens of thousands of additional people die in a war that is already decided? Jon heard it. The utilitarian logic, clean and terrible, that mass death justified through the mathematics of fewer deaths overall. He had lived in a world of justifications like this. He had been used as a tool by men who wielded this logic the way other men wielded swords. You're telling me the Red Wedding requires this document to stay out of Lannister hands, Jon said. I'm telling you that the war's conclusion requires it. Littlefinger's voice was perfectly level. I'm not asking you to endorse the conclusion. I'm asking you to intercept a document. How many people in the Tully escort? 12 riders, 2 knights. Jon looked at the red keep on its hill above the city. He thought about Robb Stark, whom he'd never met, and about a war he had no stake in, and about a document that was a stone in a mechanism that would grind thousands of people to nothing. He thought about Varys saying the real game is north and meaning it is something other than a deflection. He thought about what intercepting the document meant, not for Littlefinger's arrangements, for the thing that came after the war, for whether Westeros arrived at the long night with enough of itself intact to matter. I'll intercept the document, Jon said. I keep it, not you. Littlefinger's composure remained perfect. That's not the arrangement. It is now, Jon said. You get the document out of Lannister hands. I hold it. If your arrangement proceeds the way you've described, if the war ends and the dying stops, I give it to you. He looked at Littlefinger directly. If it doesn't proceed that way, if the document turns out to be a piece of something larger that I haven't been told about, I find a different use for it. You're leveraging me with my own leverage. I'm establishing terms, Jon said. You want a variable Cersei can't account for. So you want someone outside the game. This is what outside the game looks like. It doesn't operate on good faith. It operates on verified outcomes. Littlefinger studied him for a long time. The market moved around them. The gold cloaks had finished with the spice vendor and were moving on to a cloth merchant with the same expectations. Chaos is a ladder, Littlefinger said finally, almost to himself. A private thought that had escaped. I've climbed ladders, Jon said. I've also pulled them down. He turned away from the market. I'll need the escort's route and timing. Behind him, Littlefinger stood in the market crowd and watched him go, with the expression of a man who had set a trap and wasn't certain whether he'd caught something or something had caught him. He had maneuvered kings. He had started wars. He had moved the most powerful people in Westeros like pieces on a Savas board. He had never, in all his years of climbing, encountered a piece that looked back at him and understood the board. He sent the road information that evening because the alternative was acknowledging he had no move, and Petyr Baelish had not survived this long by acknowledging the absence of moves. He would find one. He always found one. He just needed, for the first time in his life, a moment to think. The Tully escort rode the King's Road 3 days north of King's Landing, 12 riders and 2 knights moving at the pace of men who believed their destination was more dangerous than the road. Jon intercepted them on the second day, at a narrowing of the road where a limestone outcrop created a natural choke point that the escort's outriders had assessed and decided was acceptable risk. The outriders were wrong. It took 11 minutes. And Jon moved through it the way he moved through everything, with the economy of someone who had learned that additional motion was additional exposure, that the gap between fast and efficient was where people got killed, that 2 knights in Tully colors were still 2 knights regardless of the colors and required the specific approach that armor and training demanded. He put down 3 riders before the escort understood the shape of what was happening to them. He put down 4 more before they could reform. The 2 knights he handled consecutively in the road's center, using the limestone outcrop's shadow and the specific vulnerability that mounted combat created, when the horse was removed from the equation. Nobody died. This required more precision than killing them. The document was in a sealed leather case on the escort captain, who surrendered it with the expression of a man filing the experience away for later psychological processing. Whilst John rode back toward King's Landing with the document case and the specific feeling of a man who had done something he understood to be wrong in the service of something he believed might be necessary, and who had learned in a previous life that this feeling never entirely went away and shouldn't, because the day it did was the day you'd become the thing you'd been fighting. He held the document. He thought about what Varys had said about the North. He thought about what it meant that he was now holding leverage over Littlefinger, working within Tywin's awareness, holding the Iron Bank's completed contract, and owing the faceless men 3 names. And that none of it, none of the elaborate political machinery he'd become entangled in, addressed the thing the faceless man had mentioned as a footnote: the cold, the dead, the wall. He needed to go north. He told Tyrion first. Not because Tyrion had the most power in the current configuration. Tywin held that, and Varys held the information architecture that surrounded it, and Littlefinger held the specific leverage that made both of them occasionally more manageable than they appeared. He told Tyrion because Tyrion was the only person in King's Landing who had demonstrated the capacity to hear true things and update his behavior accordingly, rather than filtering them through what he needed to be true, which was the rarer and more valuable cognitive skill, and the one that mattered most when the true thing in question was that everyone in the city was arranging deck furniture with tremendous sophistication, while the ship moved towards something that made the furniture irrelevant. They were in Tyrion's chambers in the Tower of the Hand, smaller than Jon had expected, organized in the way of someone who had learned to make confined spaces functional, with books stacked in arrangements that suggested they were actually read rather than displayed, and wine in quantities that suggested it served a genuine psychological purpose rather than a social one. A narrow window looked north, which Jon noted as either coincidence or something Tyrion had arranged deliberately, and the evening light came through it in a way that made the room feel like the last warm room before something cold. "The Night's Watch is requesting men," Tyrion said. When Jon finished, he said it in the tone of someone confirming information they'd been sitting on, waiting for the correct moment to produce. "Lord Commander Mormont sent ravens to every major house 3 moons past. The responses have been, characteristically, focused on the political utility of providing or withholding aid, rather than the substance of the request." He turned his wine cup. "I've read the reports, not the summaries the mesters prepared for the small council, which were edited for palatability. The actual reports, rangers going beyond the wall and not returning, corpses found in configurations that suggest they walked somewhere after dying." He looked at Jon. "What did the faceless man tell you?" "That it was coming south," Jon said. "That the cold moved with intention." "The cold moves with intention," Tyrion repeated as though testing how the sentence felt. "That's not a thing anyone in this city wants to hear. Because if it's true, then everything they're currently doing is wrong, and no one who has invested this much in what they're currently doing wants to discover it's wrong." He set the wine down. "My father knows. Not believes, knows. He has the same reports I have. He's chosen to treat it as a problem for whoever sits the Iron Throne after the war concludes, on the theory that a threat requiring unified response is better addressed by a unified Westeros than a divided one." He paused. "Yes, it's not an irrational position. It's not wrong," Jon said. "It's just too slow." He had spent 3 days preparing for the North, not rushing the preparation, because rushed preparation was the category of mistake that killed people who should have survived, but working through it with the systematic thoroughness that the environment demanded. He had acquired cold weather gear through the bank's King's Landing contact, a heavy wool and leather in layers that prioritize function over appearance. He had acquired a horse from a Lannister stableman who had been compensated with Braavosy gold and an absence of questions. He had acquired information from every source available to him about the wall's geography, the Night's Watch's current strength, and the territory beyond it, which was to say he had acquired very little useful tactical information, because the territory beyond the wall was the region of the known world that the known world had collectively decided it preferred not to know. He had also, before leaving Littlefinger's information in the operative arrangement they'd negotiated, read the document he'd intercepted from the Tully escort. All of it. Twice. It told him more about Westerosi power than 3 weeks of instruction in the House of Black and White. It told him that the Red Wedding was not a plan so much as a convergence of incentives that Littlefinger had identified and aligned rather than constructed. That the phrase grievance was real, the Lannister interest was real, and the money that had changed hands was the lubricant rather than the engine. It told him that the mechanism would proceed regardless of the document's location, because mechanisms built from genuine human incentives didn't require a document to run. The document was evidence of the mechanism's existence, not the mechanism itself. He had kept this understanding. He had not shared it with Littlefinger, who he suspected knew it already, and had used the document as a test rather than a genuine operational requirement. He filed Littlefinger in the category of problems he would address when he returned from the North, assuming he returned from the North, which he intended to. "I need you to do something," Jon told Tyrion. "So helping people go north is not something I'm asked to do frequently," Tyrion said. "It's usually the opposite direction. Get a message to Jon Snow at the Wall. Tell him someone is coming who isn't Night's Watch and isn't a wildling and isn't a threat to his command, and who has information about what's moving beyond the Wall that he needs to hear before the ranging season ends." Jon looked at the narrow window and its northern light. "Tell him to hold his judgment until after the conversation." Tyrion studied him. "Jon Snow is the bastard son of Ned Stark, recently executed for the crime of being honest in a city that runs on dishonesty. He has his father's face and his father's honor and considerably better survival instincts than his father, which means he might actually live long enough for those instincts to matter." He paused. "He'll meet you. Jon Snow has never yet turned away anyone who came to him with a genuine threat and a willingness to face it. A beat. He also has never turned away anyone who reminded him in some fundamental way that there are things more important than the game. You'll remind him. Send the raven. Consider it sent." Tyrion reached for his wine. "One more thing. Cersei has moved from systematic to urgent in her assessment of you. The 6 men she sent to the tanner's workshop were the opening offer. She's preparing something more considered." He looked at Jon over the cup's rim. "She's contacted the faceless men." Jon was still for a moment. "She has the gold for it," Tyrion continued. "She has the motivation. You've made her feel something she doesn't tolerate feeling, which is genuinely outmaneuvered. And she has the particular determination of a woman who has spent her entire life having her options constrained by men, and has consequently learned to use the options she does have with absolute efficiency." He set the cup down. "The faceless men have a contract on you. From Cersei, presumably. Though with the faceless men, the principle is never certain." He paused. "Does this change your plans?" Jon thought about the House of Black and White, the no-name man and the borrowed face and the gold coin that had torn him through, the girl with the stillness and the flinch she was trying to lose, the 3 names he owed the many-faced god, which he hadn't yet given. "No," he said, "it changes theirs." He left King's Landing before dawn, through the Gate of the Gods and north on the King's Road, with the cold weather gear and the horse and the Bravosi blade and the 2 shorter weapons and the document case containing leverage over Littlefinger that he'd left with Tyrion for safekeeping, which was itself leverage over Tyrion. Though Tyrion had understood this immediately and accepted it anyway, because Tyrion was the kind of man who preferred known leverage to unknown intentions. The King's Road North was a different world than King's Landing. Not immediately, because the city's influence extended through the villages and way castles of the Crownlands like a long shadow, and the roads were maintained, and the traffic was sufficient, and the evidence of civilization was continuous enough that the transition felt gradual. But gradual transitions were still transitions. And by the 3rd day the road had thinned, and the traffic had thinned with it, and the sky had taken on the particular quality of northern skies. Wider, colder, less interested in the human activity occurring beneath it. He passed through the Riverlands without incident, which required careful navigation because the Riverlands were currently the physical space where the War of 5 Kings was being conducted. And careful navigation meant moving off the road when column movement was audible ahead, and rejoining it when the sound had passed, and reading the smoke on the horizon to determine whether it was cookfire or conquest. He saw two Lannister outrider groups and one Stark patrol moving southeast. The patrol's bannermen riding with the specific posture of men who had been in the field too long and were beginning to understand that the field was not going to end. He did not engage any of them. They were not his problem yet. The neck was the threshold, the narrow, boggy territory that separated the Riverlands from the North proper, controlled by House Reed from Greywater Watch, a castle that apparently moved location through the marshes with a consistency that had defeated every military attempt to capture it and most cartographic attempts to document it. John moved through the neck in 2 days of wet, cold travel that tested his cold weather gear and found it adequate. He saw no reeds. He saw Crannogmen twice, watching from distances that suggested they'd been tracking him since before he'd noticed them, which he acknowledged with a slight nod that seemed to satisfy whatever assessment they were conducting. The North received him the way the North received everything, without ceremony, without warmth, with the impartial coldness of an environment that had survived long enough to develop opinions about what survived in it. The landscape opened into something enormous and gray and old, the sky larger here than it had been anywhere south, the trees the ancient dark-needled variety that seemed less like individual trees than like the surface expression of something vast beneath the ground. He reached Winterfell on the 7th day north of the Neck. The castle was exactly what the name suggested, a fortress built for winter, thick-walled and practical, its towers less about grandeur than about visibility, its gates less about welcome than about the serious evaluation of everything that approached them. It smelled of pine smoke and horse and the specific cold of stone that had absorbed centuries of northern weather and stopped trying to warm itself. The gate guards were young, which meant the experienced men were elsewhere. At war, or at the wall, or dead, the three destinations that Westerosi conflict reliably produced. And they looked at John with the cautious assessment of men whose lord was gone and whose lady was managing in his absence with the particular competence of someone who had learned that competence was the only protection available. "I'm here for Robb Stark," John said, because Tyrion's raven had been sent to the wall, but Robb was in the field and the field moved, and Winterfell was the fixed point. Nasha or whoever holds Winterfell while he's absent. The older of the two gate guards looked at him for a long moment. "Lady Stark is in residence," he said. "She'll determine who sees who." John waited because the alternative was 6 things he declined to do to people who were doing their jobs. Catelyn Tully Stark received him in the Great Hall, a woman who had lost her husband to Lannister scheming and was in the process of watching the war to avenge him go wrong in ways she partly understood and could not stop, with the specific grief of someone whose intelligence had always been sufficient to see the shape of events and had never been sufficient to prevent them. She sat in the high seat with her back straight and her eyes doing what John's eyes did, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who had learned to assess strangers quickly because quick assessment was the skill that had kept her children alive this long. "You came from King's Landing," she said. "Not a question. And before that, from further away than that. Tyrion's raven said you were going to the wall." She looked at him steadily. "It also said you had information about what's beyond it." "Yes." "Tell me," she said. "Tell me everything." Because whatever is happening in the South, I need to know if there's something coming from the North that makes it irrelevant." Her voice was controlled and absolutely serious. "My sons are at war. I need to know if the war they're fighting is the wrong war." John looked at Catelyn Stark in the great hall of Winterfell, with the torches burning and the cold pressing against the thick walls and the sound of the wind doing something outside that sounded almost like language. "Huckred, it's the wrong war," he said. The wall announced itself 2 days before he reached it. Not visually. The terrain intervened, rolling and forested and indifferent, blocking sight lines the way the North blocked most things, through sheer accumulation of landscape rather than deliberate obstruction. It announced itself through temperature, which dropped with a consistency that suggested not weather but principle, as though the air itself had decided that a certain latitude was where warmth ended and something else began. It announced itself through sound, or rather through the quality of silence that surrounded sound. The wind here had a different register, lower and more sustained, carrying in it the particular emptiness of enormous space. And beneath the wind, there was something that wasn't quite audible and wasn't quite not. Utterly a subsonic presence that John felt in his back teeth and in the base of his sternum, and recognized instinctively as the feeling of proximity to something very old and very serious. He had felt it once before, in a very different world, standing outside a building in New York that a man named Winston had told him was neutral ground, where the rules applied absolutely and the violence stopped at the threshold. The feeling of a boundary that meant something more than geography. Could Castle Black materialize from the gray morning in stages? First, the wall itself, 700 feet of ancient ice rising from the earth with the verticality of something that hadn't grown but had been imposed. A human statement made in frozen water that had been making the same statement for 8,000 years and showed no inclination to stop. Then the castle at its base, which was less a castle than a collection of buildings arranged around the wall's southern face, with the pragmatic disorder of something that had been built and rebuilt and added to and partially abandoned over the millennia without any governing aesthetic principle beyond functionality, and the specific stubbornness of men who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. The Night's Watch watched him come from the wall's top. He could see them, small figures against the ice's gray-white face, tracking his approach with the attention of men who had learned that things coming from the south were usually disappointments, and things coming from the north were usually worse. Jon Snow met him at the gate. He was younger than Jon had expected from Tyrion's description, not in years, which placed him somewhere in his late teens, but in the specific way that people who had been through significant things sometimes seemed younger rather than older, because the significant things had stripped away the performance of experience and left the actual person underneath, which was always younger than the performance. He had his father's face, which Jon had never seen but which was visible in him the way architecture was visible in ruins. The structure beneath the surface, the form that everything else had been built around. He had dark eyes that did the cataloging thing without appearing to, and he stood at the gate with a dire wolf the size of a small horse sitting at his heel, like a theological argument for the existence of things outside normal parameters. The direwolf looked at Jon. Jon looked at the direwolf. The direwolf made no sound, which was more communicative than sound would have been. "You're the man from Tyrion's Raven," Jon said. "Yes, John Wick. Jon Snow." He looked at Jon with the measured assessment of someone who had learned to read threats quickly and had been burned by misreading them. "Tyrion said you have information. He also said I should hold my judgment until after the conversation." A pause. "He said that specifically, which means he expected I'd have a strong first reaction." "Probably," Jon said. "Panna, come inside." Castle Black inside was exactly what the wall's exterior promised. Functional to the point of austerity, built around the assumption that comfort was a concern for people who live somewhere else, organized with the efficiency of an institution that had been performing the same essential function for 8,000 years and had stripped everything away that didn't serve that function. It smelled of torch smoke and old stone, and the specific cold that accumulated in places where stone and ice were always in contact and had reached a thermal equilibrium somewhere well below what humans found comfortable. Jon Snow's quarters were small, 2 chairs, a table, a map of the territory beyond the wall that had been updated in recent months with additions that the original cartographer hadn't included. Positions, movements, something marked in red ink that Jon leaned toward and read as approximate locations of White Walker sightings. The map was better intelligence than anything he'd been given in King's Landing, which told him that the Night's Watch, whatever its current inadequacies, was at least paying attention to the right problem. He told Jon everything, not the King's Landing architecture, the Lannisters and Tyrion and Littlefinger's document, which were not relevant to this conversation. The relevant material was what he'd assembled from the faceless man's footnote, and Varys's window exit speech, and Catelyn Stark's questions in Winterfell's Great Hall, and his own 3 days at Winterfell, reading every Raven correspondence that Maester Luwin had maintained from the wall over the past year, which Catelyn had granted him access to with the pragmatic openness of a woman who had decided that information hoarding was a luxury the current situation didn't permit. The picture that emerged from all of it was not complicated in its broad shape. The army of the dead was moving. The Night King, a figure the Night's Watch reports named obliquely, with the specific reluctance of men describing something they didn't have adequate language for, was directing the movement with the patience of an entity that understood that time worked differently for things that didn't die. The ranging parties that hadn't returned weren't lost, and they were contributing to the army's numbers, which grew with each body the cold reached. John listened without interrupting, which was the rarest quality John had encountered in this world. "How do you know this?" John said when John finished. "Not the ravens. Anyone could read the ravens. The faceless man. The thing you described about feeling the wall before you saw it. The way you're describing the Night King's strategy as though you've assessed it tactically." He looked at John steadily. "You're not a maester. You're not a ranger. What are you?" "In my world," John said, "I was the man people sent to solve problems that other methods couldn't solve. A killer. Yes. And you think killing solves what's beyond that wall?" "No," John said. "I think killing is a component, the same way it's a component in any problem that has a military dimension. But I've been in King's Landing for 2 weeks watching the most powerful people in Westeros treat the wall like a budget concern and the army of the dead like a rumor, and someone needed to come here and confirm that the people at the wall aren't wrong." John was quiet for a moment. The direwolf had followed them inside and was now lying across the doorway with the relaxed vigilance of something that didn't need to perform alertness, because its alertness was simply operational. "Come hard home," John said. "Tell me." What John described took 40 minutes and left a specific quality of silence when he finished. The silence of information that reorganized everything around it. Hardhome was a wildling settlement on the coast beyond the wall, and what had happened there was not a battle in any sense that the word battle carried from any military tradition John had encountered. It was a demonstration. The Night King had stood on a cliff above a bay full of dead and raised his arms, and the dead had risen, and he had looked at Jon Snow across the water with the specific quality of attention that very powerful things directed at threats they had identified and were not yet ready to address. "He looked at you," Jon said. "Yes. And you're still here." "Yes." "He let you leave." Jon met his eyes. "He let me leave." Jon processed this. In his world, when things that could kill you let you leave, it was because your death served their purpose better alive, or because your escape served a purpose you didn't yet understand. The Night King's calculus was older and stranger than anything he'd encountered, but the structural logic was similar. Jon Snow was more useful to the Night King as a demonstration of the Night King's power than as a corpse in the army. Or Jon Snow was the specific threat the Night King was building toward. "Ask Dragonglass," Jon said. "Valyrian steel. Those kill them." "Yes." "How much Dragonglass does the Watch have?" Jon's expression answered before his words did. "Not enough. Stannis brought some. Not enough. There's a cache at Dragonstone, supposedly. A mountain of it, if the old texts are accurate. But Dragonstone is across the narrow sea from a Targaryen girl with dragons," Jon said. "Shivering, yes." Jon stood and looked at the map with its red ink additions and thought about what he was looking at, which was not a map but a countdown. The positions marked in red were moving south. The rate of movement wasn't fast by any standard that applied to conventional armies, but conventional armies didn't have the Night King's patience or the Winter's assistance, and the wall, 8,000 years old, enormous, and magical in ways even the Night's Watch didn't fully understand, was the only thing between the countdown and everything south of it. "I need to go beyond the wall," Jon said. Jon looked at him. "Why?" "Because I need to see it. Not the Raven's version, not the Survivor's version. What it actually is, how it moves, where it's concentrated and where it isn't." He turned from the map. "And because I have 3 debts to pay to a god of death in Bravos, and I think I've just identified the names." The ranging party went out the following morning. Jon Snow, John Wick, 6 Night's Watch Rangers, and the Direwolf, which went where Jon went with the consistency of something that had decided this was its purpose and found the decision uncomplicated. The wall's gate opened with the sound of mechanisms that had been operating for millennia, enormous and precise, And the cold that came through it was not the cold of the north proper. Which was merely the cold of a place that took cold seriously. This was different. This was the cold of a place where cold was not a condition, but an atmosphere, a presence, filling the space between the trees with the specific weight of intention that John had felt in his back teeth 2 days south and now felt in everything. And the forest beyond the wall was silent in the way that forests become silent when everything that lived in them had decided that the most important thing they could do was not attract attention. The trees were ancient and enormous and dark, their canopies blocking what light the winter sun provided in what felt less like shade and more like a considered opinion about visibility. The snow on the ground was undisturbed, not the undisturbed snow of a place where nothing moved on it, but the undisturbed snow of a place where everything that moved had learned to move without leaving evidence. They found the first white 4 miles north of the wall. It had been a ranger, Night's Watch black still on it, the crow's badge still at its breast, the face recognizable as human in structure, if not in the quality of what animated it. The blue eyes were the worst part, not because they were frightening in the conventional sense, but because they were attentive, tracking, assessing, Tucker present in the way that dead things were not present, directed by something external that used the dead the way a puppeteer used a marionette, which meant the puppeteer knew they were there. John put it down with the Bravosi blade, the dragon glass he'd acquired from the watch's depleted stores before leaving, shaped into a rough edge that he'd fitted to a handle from a ranger's broken spear. And it collapsed with the specific finality of something whose animating principle had been removed rather than whose body had been damaged. Fast, John said, watching. Not criticism, assessment. They don't block, John said. They don't need to. They're not trying to survive. They're trying to add to the count. He looked at the collapsed body. Well, how many can he raise at once? We don't know. Estimate. John looked north, where the trees continued into a darkness that was becoming less metaphorical as the day progressed. Thousands, he said. At Hardhome, there were thousands. The reports from rangers before they stopped coming back suggested. He stopped. More than thousands, John said. Nara, yes. They moved north for another 2 miles before John heard it. Not with his ears first, but with the back teeth sensation that the wall had produced at a distance. Close enough now to be something other than presence. Close enough to be signal. He stopped the column with a raised fist, and they stopped. And in the silence that the stopped column produced, he heard what the silence contained. Movement. Not the movement of individual things, but of a mass. The sound that a crowd made, if a crowd were cold and patient and dead and moving through snow with the unified purpose of something that didn't require coordination, because it was already coordinated, because the coordination came from a single point of will that moved it the way a mind moved a hand. North-northwest, John said quietly. 2 miles, maybe less. John heard it too. He could see the recognition in the direwolf's posture, which had changed from operational alertness to something more focused, the animal's gray head turning toward the same bearing John had indicated. We need to move, John said. Give me 60 seconds, John said. He moved 20 meters north alone, into the tree line, into the edge of the sound's radius, and looked. Through the ancient dark trees, in the gray winter light, at a distance that made detail difficult, but presence unmistakable, where the army of the dead moved through the forest like a tide, not fast, not slow, with the specific patience of something that had all the time that existed and knew it. And above them, on a ridge that the terrain created naturally, a figure stood and watched the army move and, as John looked, turned its head. The Night King looked at John Wick across 2 miles of frozen forest. John looked back. It lasted 3 seconds. Then John turned and walked back to the column and said, Wick, now will we move? And they moved, and behind them in the forest the army continued its patient southward progression, and the Night King watched the column retreat with the expression, if the word applied, of something that had identified a variable it hadn't accounted for. It did not pursue. Which was, John understood, either because pursuit was tactically unnecessary or because the Night King, like all genuinely dangerous things, preferred to choose the time and place of its confrontations. When he had delivered that preference himself many times, he understood it completely. 2 miles south of the wall, with Castle Black's torches visible ahead, Jon Snow said, "You looked at him." "Yes. Most men can't." "I've looked at worse," Jon said, which was not entirely true but was true enough to say. "What did you see?" Jon thought about the Night King on the ridge and about what he'd recognized in the exchange. The assessment, the filing, watched the patient intelligence of something that thought in timescales that made human strategy look like improvisation. "Something that thinks," he said, "something that plans, something that has been doing this for a very long time and is very good at it." He paused. "And something that just learned this particular problem is more complicated than it looked." Jon was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are the three names? The ones you mentioned. What's the ones you owe the many-faced god?" Jon had been thinking about this since the ridge. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I know what I'm looking for." "What?" "The right three deaths," Jon said, "that make the difference between enough and not enough." The wall's gate opened before them. The cold followed them through it, pressing at their backs. And then the gate closed, and the mechanisms engaged, and the wall stood between them and the army of the dead, with its 8,000 years of deliberate purpose. And Jon stood in Castle Black's yard and looked up at the ice above him, and felt for the first time since a shimmer in a New York alley had delivered him into this world. Something that wasn't quite a plan, but was the shape a plan would take. It was enough to work with. He sent 3 ravens south before dawn. The first went to Tyrion Lannister in King's Landing, written in the compressed language of someone who understood that ravens were read by maester intermediaries, and that useful information required a layer of obscurity that plausible deniability could survive. It said in the cramped hand Jon had been developing since Braavos, "The debt is real. The creditor is patient. Send word to Dragonstone. The mountain there has currency the North requires urgently. The interest compounds daily." So Tyrion would understand. Tyrion understood everything phrased as financial metaphor, because Tyrion had spent his life in a family that treated everything as financial metaphor, and had consequently become fluent in the language. The second went to the Iron Bank's King's Landing representative, shorter and more direct, because the bank's people operated on clarity rather than subtlety. Dragonglass, Dragonstone, quantities sufficient to arm a garrison of 10,000. The bank's investment in Westerosi stability requires this as precondition. Build the throne. He didn't know if the bank could compel access to Dragonstone's Dragonglass deposits, which currently sat in the possession of Stannis Baratheon's skeleton court. He suspected the bank's leverage over Stannis, who had borrowed substantially to fund his continued claim, was sufficient to make the request more than advisory. The third raven was the one that took him the longest to write. It went to Braavos, to the House of Black and White, to the no-name man with the borrowed face who had made a mistake and owed a debt and whose god Jon was about to pay in the most specific currency the god accepted. He wrote 3 names, not Cersei's name, though Cersei had contracted the faceless men against him, and the contract was presumably active, and the faceless men's theology regarding counter-obligations was something he'd need to address. Not Littlefinger's name, although Littlefinger was a cancer in the body of Westerosi politics, whose removal would prevent more suffering than almost any other single action available. Not Tywin's name, though Tywin's continued existence was the organizing principle of the Lannister machine that was grinding the continent into the shape most convenient for Lannister survival. He wrote the names of 3 White Walker lieutenants. He had identified them from the Night's Watch reports. Not named, not because the Night's Watch didn't have names for them, but described with enough specificity across multiple accounts that he'd been able to construct individual profiles from the consistency of their behavior patterns. One was described repeatedly as the first to arrive at ranging party engagements. The advance element, the scout equivalent, the thing that appeared before the army proper and assessed before reporting back. One was described as directing the raising of fallen rangers. The animator, the one whose specific gesture seemed to trigger reanimation rather than the Night King's broader raising. One had been seen at Hardhome standing beside the Night King on the cliff, which placed it in the command structure at a level that suggested it carried authority the other walkers deferred to. Take away the scout, and the Army's advanced intelligence degraded. Wick, take away the animator and the Army's growth rate slowed. Take away the command element, and the Night King was operating with a reduced staff at a moment when the campaign's complexity was increasing. He didn't know if the many-faced God's gift could reach beyond the wall. He didn't know if the faceless men had the capability or the willingness to move against targets that weren't human in any sense the word had previously been applied. He didn't know if dragon glass-tipped instruments in faceless men's hands could accomplish what they accomplished in anyone else's. He wrote the names anyway, with descriptions attached, and sent the Raven, because in his experience, the correct response to uncertainty about whether something would work was to attempt it with maximum preparation and observe the result. He had been operating on this principle his entire professional life, when it had kept him alive through situations where the probability assessment suggested it shouldn't have. Jon Snow found him at the Master's rookery as the last Raven was released. "You're going back south," Jon said. It wasn't a question. He'd read it in something, the specific quality of Jon's movements that morning, the finality of 3 Ravens released before dawn. "Yes, King's Landing." Eventually, Jon watched the Raven diminish against the gray sky until it became invisible, until it was just a direction rather than a thing. There are arrangements that need concluding, people who've made decisions they don't yet understand the full consequences of. Jon stood beside him at the rookery window, and they looked south together, the same bearing the Ravens had taken, the direction where the continent was busy destroying itself over a chair, while the thing that would make the chair irrelevant moved patiently through the ancient forest behind them. "Wait, what you said last night," Jon said, "about the right 3 deaths making the difference between enough and not enough." He turned to look at Jon. "Do you actually believe that? That the right individual actions at the right moment can change what's coming?" Jon thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about a dog and a car, and a grief that had restructured everything. He thought about a gold coin on a stone floor in a New York alley, and a man in a mask who had moved wrong, and a shimmer in the air that had deposited him on Bravo Sea docks, with a wound in his side and a world he didn't recognize around him. He thought about Tyrion's wine cup and Varys's window, and Littlefinger's ladder, and Tywin's face in a torchlit council chamber, and Catelyn Stark sitting straight-backed in Winterfell's Great Hall, asking if her sons were fighting the wrong war. And he thought about the Night King on the ridge, and the 3 seconds of mutual assessment across 2 miles of frozen forest, and the quality of intelligence he'd recognized in that exchange. Not human, not warm, but genuine, strategic, patient, and entirely aware that the situation had developed a variable it hadn't planned for. "I believe that the wrong individual and actions guarantee failure," Jon said. "And whether the right actions guarantee success, that depends on whether you do them correctly, and whether you do enough of them, and whether you start soon enough." He paused. "Conrad, the answer to all 3 is currently uncertain." "Then why are you going back to King's Landing?" "Because the dragon glass is at Dragonstone, and the dragons are coming west, and the person who controls both needs to understand that the North isn't a military campaign she can add to her conquest. It's the reason the conquest matters or doesn't." He turned from the window. "And because I have unfinished business with a woman named Cersei who has contracted for my death, and leaving that unresolved creates a problem for everyone I've made arrangements with in this city." Jon was quiet for a moment. The direwolf had appeared at the rookery door in the silent way it appeared everywhere, without announcement, without the performance of arrival, simply present in the way that things were present when they decided to be somewhere. "You'll come back," Jon said. Not a question this time either, but a different kind of not question. The statement of a man who had decided something and was telling it to the world rather than asking the world's opinion. "Yes," Jon said, "with dragonglass. With dragonglass. And possibly with a more complicated political situation than either of us would prefer. But that seems to be the condition of everything in this world." Jon Snow extended his hand. It was a Westerosi gesture, formal, weighted, was the specific handclasp of men who were making a commitment rather than exchanging pleasantries. Jon took it, and they held it for a moment. And in that moment, John Wick understood something about Jon Snow that Tyrion's description had approximated but not captured. The man was not honorable in the way that got Ned Stark killed, which was honor as principle divorced from consequence. When he was honorable in the way that was actually more dangerous. Honor as the thing you held on to specifically because everything around you was trying to take it, because the act of holding it was the resistance itself. He recognized the posture. He had held something similar once, and it had cost him everything, and he would do it again because that was the nature of the thing you held when everything was trying to take it. He left Castle Black as the morning properly established itself, a gray and cold and enormous, the wall at his back and the road south ahead, and the continent spread before him in all its complicated burning, scheming, magnificent dysfunction. He rode through the first hour in silence, the horse finding its pace, the wall diminishing behind him until it was a line at the horizon and then a concept rather than a structure. He thought about what waited in King's Landing, the Cersei problem and its active contract, and the Littlefinger document and its leveraged arrangement, the Tywin situation and its asymmetric information, the Tyrion alliance and its genuine fragility, Varys's realm-serving agenda and its uncertain compatibility with Jon's more specific priorities. And above all of them, threading through all of them, the thing that none of them were adequately treating as the priority it was. The army moving through the ancient forest, the Night King's patient strategy, home of the winter that was coming in a sense that the Starks had been saying for centuries, and that everyone else had been mishearing as weather. He had delivered 3 ravens. He had stood beyond the wall and looked at the thing that was coming and taken its measure and been measured in return. He had made arrangements in King's Landing that would either hold or would need to be enforced, and enforcement was a language John Wick spoke fluently. And he had 3 names owed to a god of death in Braavos, and the specific hope that the god's reach extended beyond the wall to things that weren't alive in any sense the god had previously been asked to address. He had unfinished business in every direction. Somewhere south of him, a raven was carrying his instructions toward an iron bank that financed kingdoms and might, if the argument was correctly framed, finance the survival of everyone those kingdoms contained. Somewhere further south, a Tyrion Lannister was reading a message in financial metaphor and translating it in real time and making the specific face he made when he received information that was simultaneously necessary and inconvenient. Somewhere across the narrow sea, a girl with dragons was looking west and calculating the geometry of conquest in ways that didn't yet account for the variable that had appeared at the wall and was riding south to complicate her calculations. Somewhere behind him, the army of the dead moved through the forest with its patient, terrible purpose, and the Night King stood above it and knew with the intelligence of something that had seen 8,000 years of human failure, that the continent below the wall would spend its last months of safety arguing about who deserved to rule it. He was not wrong, but he hadn't accounted for John Wick. The King's Road stretched south through the gray northern morning, and John Wick rode it with the specific quality of forward motion that belonged to men who had identified their next problem and were moving toward it rather than away from something else. The wall stood behind him. King's Landing waited ahead. The long night pressed its cold patience against the edges of everything. He had work to do. He rode south, and the wind came with him. And somewhere in the city that would eventually hear his name in whispers, pass between frightened lords and cautious small folk, and one sardonic dwarf who would raise a cup in private acknowledgement, the Game of Thrones continued its elaborate performance of importance. Winter was still coming, but so was he. In the weeks that followed John Wick's departure from Castle Black, the known world adjusted itself around the space he'd occupied the way water adjusted around a stone. Not the same after the stone moved. The current altered. The pattern changed in ways that persisted beyond the immediate disturbance. Ravens flew between Castle Black and Dragonstone. The Iron Bank called a debt. Tyrion Lannister had 3 private conversations he didn't document anywhere that nonetheless changed 3 specific outcomes. And in the House of Black and White in Braavos, the no-named man with the borrowed face read 3 names written in a hand he recognized and sat in the pool's silence for a long time, considering what it meant that the god's mistake had sent them someone who understood death well enough to use it strategically. Littlefinger moved his pieces. Cersei sharpened her plans. The Night King moved his army. And somewhere on the King's Road, riding south through the gray enormity of a world that had no record of him and no category for what he was. A John Wick rode toward the next problem with the patience of a man who had learned that the only difference between survived and didn't was continuing to move. The Baba Yaga had come to Westeros. Winter would have to wait its turn.